Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call to order the April 26, 2018 meeting of the City of Bellingham Planning Commission. I'd like to ask everyone in the audience and commissioners and everybody to silence electronic devices. It's okay to be on a laptop or have your phone, but just make sure it's on silent, please. And with that, we'll call the roll.
Mike Estes.
Here.
Lisa Anderson.
Here.
Iris Waddy Gibson.
Here.
Garrett O'Brien.
Here.
Steve Crooks.
Here.
Ollie Taishi.
Here. And Phyllis is excused. Phyllis McKee. We do not have minutes to approve. And so what we're going to do is move right into a public comment period. And I want to be really clear about the meeting tonight. So tonight's meeting is a work session on the temporary facilities for the unsheltered. And so we're going to have an opportunity, people who want to comment on that topic, on tonight's topic, there's going to be another opportunity later in the meeting for you to comment. The public comment that I'm talking about right now is for other topics. So if everyone has an opportunity to speak about another topic if they'd like, this is an open public comment period, and you can have a few minutes to come up and comment on anything else. If you're here to comment on tonight's subject, we'll do that later. Yeah, like later tonight. Yeah, we'll have an opportunity for anyone who wants to comment on the temporary facilities tonight. Just in a few minutes, we're just going to do this first. So just to clarify for everybody. Mike's asking when we're going to do that. The structure tonight will be that we will have a staff presentation on the topic, and then we will take public comment on the topic, and then that'll give staff an opportunity to respond if they feel like they would like to, and then we'll move into the work session where the commission can have a discussion. Excuse me, sir. Yeah. So we're going to open up the public comment for other topics, and if you have something else you'd like to talk about, yeah, now's the chance. And what you need to do is come on down to the microphone and state your name, and then we'll give you 3 minutes to make a comment to us. And I'll give you a heads up if you're running out of time.
So, my name is Jonah Lawhorn. I've been here probably about 4 times in the past. I've had several difficulties in the time that I've trying to establish myself here in town. One of which was losing a parent of mine just recently and going through a lot of issues with the homeless situation around town. My problem right now is that I see with the Bellingham Housing Authority, it's not necessarily like problematic, but it's more that there's a more efficient manner in which it can be offered housing, such as. So
Jonah, sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt. Are you commenting on like the temporary housing and housing issues, or just housing in general?
I was bringing this up as a general subject.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just want to make sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
And it's a waiting program where we have to sign in and then check in and then make sure you're there. And the waiting program makes it so it's a very slow and inefficient process of getting people in placement for housing. I recommend like a system of multiple lines instead of just one singular line, where people can, like sort of like how you do at the DSHS office or the SSI office, where there's more than one person being taken care of at a time. Because right now, and more of a peer-to-peer, like individual management of housing, because everybody has different needs when it comes to having housing. And homelessness is a big problem in our town, and it really doesn't need to be. A long time ago, about a year ago, I think, I was here and I advocated on behalf of the 22 North building that's being built for the Northwest Youth Services. And that has been successful in being built and brought up and worked on ever since the last time I was here, and I'm really happy about that. And I just want to say, like, thank you to the workers who are working on it in the Northwest Youth Services, Opportunity Council, and all of them. And I'm just glad that we're actually focused on these things and actually noticing them as a priority rather than ignoring the topics. So thank you for that. And I'm all about a free and open democracy where people, as many people can be involved as possible, and getting people involved in changing things for the better. And so anything like where people can offer their hand in is always well accepted in my eyes. And I hope that's the same with here at the City Council. So that's all I wanted to say.
Hey, thank you for your comments, Jonah. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak? And again, this is topics unrelated to tonight's work session, which are temporary facilities for the unsheltered and the ordinance that we're going to be reviewing. Paul?
If it was available, yeah.
Paul, I'll give you a heads up at 30 seconds.
Okay, thank you. My name's Paul Schisler. I'm a community development planner here in Bellingham, have been for quite a few years, 20 plus years. Trying to help on many issues, especially on the issue of housing affordability. Now that over half of us who live here and rent our home can't afford that home anymore. You've heard those numbers before. 1 out of every 4 households that's renting a home spends over 50% of their gross income on housing. So how people get by is a challenge for them. And it's a wonder we don't have more people who are homeless, many people who are on the verge of homelessness. I actually wanted to come and let you know, if you don't already, that the Vienna Model Exhibition will be up through Saturday this week. And there have been a lot of people who have come through. We really appreciate the attention it's gotten so far. The Vienna Model Exhibition showcases how Vienna, Austria has been dealing with their housing affordability issue over the years. And it's really a remarkable story. The progress they have made brings them to a point where well over half of the homes in the city of Vienna are owned either by nonprofit organizations or public agencies. And they're relatively affordable. We could get there someday. So if we had the overhead, we'd show this poster to the TV viewing audience. But all it says is that this week at 221 Prospect Street, which is right downtown, same block that the new post office is on by the jail. So head back to, thank you. Or this. 221 Prospect Street from noon to 5. Tomorrow would be a good day to go. Saturday from 1 to 4, there's a convening of people interested in talking about it and figuring out what to do next. We'll be following up this exhibition with a report to the community and an invitation for people to become more familiar with what's happening there, what's happening elsewhere around the world and in the United States, things that we could be doing here in addition to all the good work we're already doing. There's a lot more we need to do, as you'll be discussing tonight. But this was an opportunity for me to invite you all, since you work on this all the time, and others who might be interested to drop in if they can this week. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Is there anybody else who'd like to make a general public comment? And again, there'll be an opportunity to comment on the ordinance and we're in a short bit after the staff presentation. Anybody? Yeah, you come on down. Remember to share your name.
Hi, everybody.
Hey.
I'm a homeless woman, and I'm disabled, and it's really hard out there. There's a lot of us that I'm seeing that I don't comprehend, and it's really hard. And we're trying to get help. I've seen people where they've been harassed by cops and everything. I've seen people that have been kicked off the bus because they had a smell and everything. Where they could maybe make something where at the library where they can help out people that are illiterate, to where they can go on the computer and be able to get the help. Housing is another thing that's a problem with me, is that I only get $1,450, and it's really hard to get a place with that amount. And trying to go to the library and doing that, like what he was talking about, it's really hard with certain income and I just want to put that out, that there's other stuff going on besides what you guys know.
Thank you. Okay, so we have someone else?
Hello, my name is Evan Rogers. I've been houseless by choice in Alaska and Santa Cruz, California, and it's a different experience everywhere. Something to consider maybe would be some public shower facilities. It's not just for the houseless, but could actually be an asset if designed properly for people who want to commute on a bicycle to work. And so it doesn't have to be just about houselessness. And when you're thinking about, or when anybody's thinking about homeless people in Bellingham or somewhere, it'd probably be good to include, I don't know if it's included in statistics or not, but the amount of people who have houses only because of welfare assistance. If that's something that were to, for some reason, disappear, there would be a whole lot more houseless people, and so that's something to take into consideration.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. Okay, any other general comments? Okay, seeing none, we will close that section of the meeting. Thank you all for commenting. And so what we're going to do is we're going to move into our work session. And again, this is on the temporary facilities for the unsheltered. And there was a draft ordinance presented in the packet. And I think we're going to have a staff presentation. Rick Sepler, the planning director, Lisa Poole, planning staff are here. And then we're going to have an opportunity to comment on this specific topic. And then we'll go into our discussion. So with that, staff?
Evening, members of the commission. I'm Rick Sepler, I'm the planning director. I'm joined by Lisa Poole, senior planner. And today we're going to talk about a series of facilities that need a process in order for us to establish them in the community. And we'll give you background on those and talk about the evolution of the draft ordinance before you. Homelessness, unfortunately, is growing in Washington state. And our last point in time, that was the 2017 point in time, there were 742 unsheltered folks. About 40% of those folks find themselves not able to fit into some of the existing facilities and services we have, can't find relatives or couches to surf on, and find themselves unsheltered at that point in time. We have focused on that, and we've seen some successes. The successes are daunted by the magnitude of the problem. And in doing that, the city spends about $4.9 million a year in housing and services for low-income and homeless residents. As noted in testimony, 22 North is funded by the housing levy, and the city is the entity that helped put that together. And it's under construction, the new expansion. Additionally, one of the things we do to help those who are unsheltered or homeless is to reduce the demands for rental units and other units. The more units that are out there, the more stability in the market, the less rent spikes up. And unfortunately, there's a significant number of folks who go homeless for every $100 increase in rent. The number is fairly staggering. Tonight, and as the basis for consideration, are two revised Code of Washington sections. These were established by the legislature, and they are in response to the growing issues found throughout Washington state to deal with those who are unsheltered. The first is RCW 3521-915. That authorizes religious organizations to host temporary encampments, either in tents or buildings. And it limits the ability of a city or a county to regulate that. So I'm going to underscore it now. It's a preemption. In essence, the state says if a religious organization, as defined by our code and by state law, wishes to do a facility, we can condition it solely for life and safety. You know, that's making sure the health and welfare is protected. We cannot deny it. Secondly, RCW 1927-042 allows cities and counties to adopt an ordinance or resolution to exempt state building code requirements from a building, provided we find that it's safe. The current drop-in center has been exempted from those regulations. Strict conformance for that use would require sprinkler systems, more restrooms, probably more areas. But because of the nature of the emergency, for up to a 5-year period, provided that the building official informed by the fire marshal feels it's safe. They have fire watch, they have extinguishers, they ban smoking, they have 24-hour staff. It could be occupied and used. Both of these recent legislation were intended to provide stopgap measures until those longer-term measures like 22 North come online. So I want to clarify why we're here before you tonight. The ordinances we have for you to consider do not select specific sites for shelters or encampments. They do not establish a process to cite those uses. All they do is establish a process to look at those uses through the lens of health and safety, to make sure we can have a safe place and that it's helpful for people to be there. In cases where the temporary encampment, either in a building or in a tent, or even a tiny home or safe parking, is located on property owned by a religious organization, the state law prevails. You might say, well, if the state law prevails, why are we doing the rules? Why do we have a process? Because we run into a point where the city finds itself in conflict. We could have a religious organization sign a lease and another body run a location there. It would meet the definition, but not provide any of those facilities for what we need, the minimum standard. And we'd have neighbors who would come forward and say, isn't this inconsistent with your zoning? How can you allow this to be? This is the way we try to reconcile that, to have a process so we can balance those interests, be mindful of the community, and still move forward with speed to provide facilities that are needed. In looking at that, there are a number of approaches we'll be considering tonight. Lisa will talk a little bit more about the regulatory background. We have some interim controls. Those are short-term emergency ordinances council has adopted to give us authority now. Those are only for us, in place for us to have the time to consider this fully, hold public hearings, get public comment, and get permanent rules on the books. There really are two approaches. The first are the temporary homeless facilities, temporary building encampments. Those would be operating in an existing building that may or may not conform with the existing code. Remember, you have an exception that can be granted through resolution or ordinance by the City Council for safety, provided we find it safe. Temporary safe parking areas, temporary tent encampments, and temporary tiny home encampments. To clarify on the tiny homes, these are the ones that the Low Income Institute would use in Seattle, like the Georgetown project. These are tents with walls. They're not the tiny homes from HGTV. These are temporary facilities that are put up to house folks on a very interim basis. And then we have permanent homeless shelters, which ultimately would mean those that would be longer term. You know, our hope is ultimately we extinguish the need for homeless shelters. That's the goal of all of our efforts. So I think permanent may be a misnomer. I think we best call it long term. What I can say is it's not that any or all of these are proposed at this time, but we need to have the set of criterions in place so that should they be proposed, we could move forward very quickly to implement them. Okay, I'm going to turn this over to Lisa, and she'll take you through the specific ordinances.
Good evening, Lisa Poole, Senior Planner. So Rick did a good job of providing an overview of the temporary facilities and the permanent homeless shelters. So I'll be brief in the rest of the presentation. But the blue portion, these four on top, are attachment 2 in the meeting packet. So they are part of one ordinance because they are all temporary in nature. And then this one in orange is attachment 3 in the meeting packet. That is a separate ordinance because it's more of the long-term nature. So attachment 2, which is one set of ordinances, deals with the temporary facilities. And that's sort of an overarching term for the 4 facility types: the temporary building encampments, the temporary tent encampments, safe parking areas, and then the temporary tiny house encampments. So all of these are proposed to be owned, operated, or managed by religious organization, nonprofit agency, or governmental entity. They are temporary shelters for people experiencing homelessness in general or for specific populations of the homeless, such as women or families. And all of the temporary facilities would be subject to land use and health and safety requirements, such as fencing, lighting, a code of conduct, trash receptacles, points of contact, etc. And then for all of these temporary facilities, a temporary use permit would be required. The temporary building encampments do have a slightly different set of requirements because they are the only type of temporary facility that would be in an actual existing building. So the first type of temporary facility, as Rick mentioned, was the temporary building encampment, and that includes a low barrier shelter or other similar uses, and the Lighthouse Mission Drop-In Center in Old Town is one such example. We're proposing that these uses be allowed in planned commercial and industrial general use type areas, and then within urban villages, the commercial and industrial areas. So for the temporary building encampments, as was mentioned, City Council amended an ordinance they had adopted earlier this year for temporary tent encampments to include the temporary building encampments, and that sets out that interim set of zoning regulations for those 2 types of encampments. They also approved Resolution 2017-26. That's per the RCW that waives building code requirements for up to 5 years. Just a little background on that. The next type of temporary facility is a temporary safe parking area, and that's pretty self-explanatory. It provides an overnight place for people living in their cars to park on a temporary basis. The next type of temporary facility is a temporary tiny house encampment, and as was mentioned, these are between 100 and 300 square feet. They're not considered dwelling units, so they don't necessarily need to conform to city or state building code requirements. And although the city building official has recommended that we add some additional safety measures specific to the tiny houses, and that would include things like battery-operated smoke and carbon monoxide detectors, no smoking, no campfires, etc. And that's really to try to keep these as safe as possible. Temporary tent encampments, that includes tents or other temporary structures. And as was mentioned, City Council adopted that interim ordinance earlier this year for the interim regulations. And that was the ordinance that was recently amended just this week, actually, to add the temporary building encampments. So attachment 3 is the separate ordinance. It's the second ordinance for permanent shelters and permanent structures. And we are looking at changing that to more of a, saying long-term instead of permanent. And these are proposed for industrial general use type areas as long as the requirements listed in the ordinance are met. And then also with the conditional use permit in urban village and commercial general use type areas where hotels and motels are permitted. And those are transient uses, so it seems to make sense to also allow these in those particular areas. And these proposed areas for where these would be allowed are really taken straight out of the city's comprehensive plan. We have a policy in the comp plan that says that homeless shelters should be allowed outright in industrial areas and with the conditional use permit in commercial areas. So we've taken a cue from that, and this is really implementing that policy. So these are just the next steps. We do have a work session scheduled for May 10th with the public hearing in June. Probably a follow-up work session with a recommendation, and then move on to city council for public hearing and work sessions. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Before we take public comment, does anybody have any brief technical or clarifying questions? Okay, we'll have an opportunity to get into it. Okay, yeah, thank you, Lisa and Rick. Okay, so with that, let's give anyone here an opportunity who wants to speak on this particular topic to have a chance to speak. And again, you'll, same thing, you'll come down, state your name, and then you'll give 3 minutes to speak on the topic, and I'll give you a heads up at about 30 seconds. And this is for comment on this specific topic, so it's the opposite. If you have a general comment unrelated to this, you can't come down and make that comment now. And so we have 4 people who signed up. And again, if you signed up and you didn't mean to, and you don't want to speak, you don't have to. And if you didn't sign up, you still can speak. This is just a guide. So the first person on the list is Dana, and then Sharon, and then Evan, and then Galen, you're on a different sheet, so you can go forth. And then after Galen, we'll go to anybody who didn't sign up. So Dana, thank you.
Good evening.
And please state your name.
My name is Dana Briggs. For your purposes, if you look at attachment 5 and it says 60% of the homeless are actually hidden, I'm one of that 60%. Okay. Let me start this off by saying that I appreciate the fact that the city is attempting to do something when it comes to homeless issues. However, while this is a step, it's not a step forward in my mind, it's more like a step sideways. And I'm going to explain to you why I think it's a step sideways at this point in time. First off, if you look at attachment 5 with the statistics that were given to you about the number of homeless that are actually in this county, I would suggest to you that there's at least 4 times the amount of homeless people that are in Whatcom County itself. And that can be borne out by the fact that 2 days ago in the county council planning committee meeting, somebody from the county health department stated that they, by their measures, know of at least 3,200 homeless people within the county. And the office of DSHS, the Bellingham office, also has statistics just based on the number of people that they service through their programs, and they're approaching 2,900 to 3,000 homeless. But that's just people that are, so that's pretty consistent. And I would suggest to you that it's actually an undercount probably, because there's a lot of homeless out there that either don't have access to services, or nobody knows about, or somebody is privately supporting them, or whatever the case may be, okay? So the statistic of 742 is down by a 4 count, at least from what I understand in the way of what's going on. That leads to the fact that you don't really at this time understand the scope of the problem within the county, okay? And because you don't understand the scope of the problem, the only real solution to this, as the gentleman alluded to earlier, is permanent affordable housing. I repeat that, permanent affordable housing. Temporary facilities are okay for emergency measures, but in the long term, we've got to have permanent affordable housing. There's no other way around this. Massive shelters, especially when they get above 100 count, have been proven time and time again to be problematic for a variety of reasons. And there's all kinds of studies that have been done across the country as to what's going on with that. As I read through the draft ordinances, I was really concerned and somewhat disappointed by the tone, and there is a tone to them, of where you're trying to potentially cite temporary facilities of any kind.
About 30 seconds, Dana.
They tend to be isolated off into industrial areas or general use areas, as opposed to potentially being placed anywhere within the community, even if you would do it with an apartment complex. And what that does is that further isolates people that are already homeless and stigmatizes them, just like the so-called vagrancy laws during the Great Depression happened in the 1930s. We don't need to be doing that. People need to be considered part of the community. So, I thank you for your efforts so far. I'm going to watch and see what goes on with this, but I think that there needs to be a refocus, and you need to get a better grasp on how big the problem really is. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Sharon, if you'd like to make a comment on this topic, and just following up on what you said, watching this, I failed to mention that we will, and I think Rick did mention this, there will be a public hearing on this topic, and we will have another work session, at least one more, so there will be additional opportunities to participate. And that public hearing is dedicated specifically to listening to the public. So please continue, anyone who's interested, please continue to pay attention, because there will be more opportunities in this process to participate. Sharon, go ahead. And then after that, Evan.
I agree to everything that he had said, to them talking about like the homeless shelter. I was in one, and I have therapy working service cats, and they threatened to throw my cat down the stairs, and I wasn't able to stay there, and so I've been out on the streets and everything, and I needed to bring that up to your guys' attention, because working animals, and I don't think they should be trying to say, hey, well, you need to be getting out of here because of the fact that a worker's talking to somebody, and then you don't want to eat in front of them and respecting them. And so the person came on over and said, you need to get out and get your stuff. And I didn't have enough way to pick it up on everything I had. And so there's a lot of people that are getting thrown out of it because there's no room or there ain't enough. And guess that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Evan Rogers, does Evan want to speak? If you made your comment that you wanted to make earlier, that's okay, yeah, but it's up to you. Specific to the topic.
I'll wait till the next meeting.
Okay, thank you, yeah. So that, Galen, and then after Galen, anyone who did not sign up who'd like to speak on the topic, more than welcome to come down and share your thoughts.
Good evening, members of the Planning Commission. My name is Galen Hers. I live in the Leonard Streets neighborhood, and I'm a member of the Bellingham Tenants Union. I thank you all for taking public comment tonight, and I'm here because I want all of my neighbors to have a home. I don't want people dying on the streets every winter, and I believe there is no the solution to homelessness or housing affordability. There are many solutions. And some housing options will work for some people and don't work for others. I support permitted encampments because they provide a good option for some of our neighbors currently experiencing homelessness. In 2016, Seattle's Department of Human Services completed a year-long evaluation of their permitted encampments. And the report's key findings found, quote, "The city's permitted encampments have met and exceeded the contracted performance measures. The model is successfully serving people who have been living outside in green belts, on the streets, in cars, and in hazardous situations." And the report found that the primary challenges are communication around policy and procedures, data collection challenges due to staffing turnover and short stays, and the need for better staff training and manageable caseloads. In Bellingham and Whatcom County, we're fortunate to have a county nonprofit, Homes Now, that wants to provide more housing options for our neighbors without homes, such as tiny house villages. They've already built tiny homes and housed people in partnership with Lummi Stepping Stones at Lummi Nation. And I've met with them, and they're good folks who want to support the community and help those who need it most. And I also want to encourage you to work with Homes Now and other nonprofits that would be affected by this ordinance to craft an ordinance that works well for them and the whole community. I know Commissioners Estes and Mate Gibson have already met with Jim and Doug from Homes Now, and I'd encourage the rest of you to meet with them as well. They want to meet with you. Jim said you can get in touch with him with his email. It's very simple. It's just jim@homesnow.org. And I'm glad that the draft ordinance allows for safe parking, safe camping, and tiny house villages. Here are 3 quick recommendations to improve the ordinance.
About 30 seconds, Galen.
Okay. In section 3C, change the screening guidelines to allow for greater visibility from the street. Seattle's ordinance, they have screening installed and maintained along each encampment boundary except for boundaries fronting an open public street, and that's less dehumanizing. In section 2C, please open the definition of sponsor to allow more people and institutions to step up and help if they want. Seattle's language, they allow sponsors, including the city of Seattle, private parties, and major educational institutions. And then lastly, please allow tiny house villages to stay in place for a year with an option to renew based on a successful operation. The proposed 90-day moving period is financially prohibitive,
Thank you.
and it won't work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Galen. Paul, looks like we have a few more speakers.
Good evening. Paul Schisler. I'm a Bellingham resident, and just speaking for myself tonight. I want to express my thanks for the city and the Planning Commission trying to figure out how to provide more housing choices for people who live here, have lived here, people who work here, and don't have much or any choice. Actually, a lot of us, as I mentioned the statistics earlier, many people have no affordable choice. They have only unaffordable choices. And with the vacancy rates as low as they are, reportedly below 1%, most people, even if they have money, don't have very many choices. And people who have only unaffordable choices have not much choice at all. And then those who can't even put together the monthly rent themselves or with others are stuck with no choice at all, except maybe sleeping outside or in a car. So although I've been an advocate for housing first, a housing first approach, that the solution to homelessness is a home, and that some people might need some help and some services to stay housed. And I still think that's the real solution to our housing problem, is more homes that people can afford. But in the meantime, we have people that have died in the wintertime and people who struggle all year long with no choice but to live pretty rough. So I've sort of reluctantly come around to thinking that we need to offer more choices, and that choice can include tiny house clusters, encampments, allowing people to sleep in a vehicle. I mean, to be able to sleep safe at night is an important thing that everyone should have access to, even if they're only sleeping in a vehicle. So I haven't had a chance to review the technical ordinance, and I'm glad there's more time for you and others to work on that. So I'll just leave it at that, and thank you for taking this up.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, come on down.
Hello again. I'm John Alarn. As a concerned citizen, as a person who has struggled through it, as a person who has dealt with homelessness himself, has lost his property due to a housing collapse that he had with Bank of America, as a person who struggled with his family, I'm trying to advocate on behalf of having long-term, sustainable, affordable housing, as well as I'm offering ideas as with the mayor as to the people to help, such as the mentally ill, the veterans who came home who didn't have a place to live when they came back, the sick, people, single mothers with children. All these people are homeless. Like, these are all allotments of people, groups of individuals who and families who need places to stay. And it's very tragic in our society, with as much abundance as we have, as much riches as we have, as much money as we have, that we can't sustain for our own people, that we can't take care of our own couple, like, I don't know if it's more of the population than the highest amount of the population, like 50%, 20%, 30%. It doesn't matter what percent of people it is. They're people, and everybody needs a place to live. And it's ridiculous that we allow that people to suffer out on the streets at night and in the cold and without food, when there are people dining right inside the building that they're suffering it, like the restaurants and the commercial estates and all the affairs that people have. There are empty buildings for heaven's sakes. There are big land masses that are gated off that can be reconstructed. There's a place right next to the drop-in center that can be opened up, that can be developed, as well as there's a building up on East Street, I think it's East Street, across the street from a pretty nice apartment complex, right next to it, a big landmass that could be used for what I foresee as a people's village, like a place where, not police state, a place where people can be free of such things, and a place where such things can be, like the mothers can look after their children, and that people can take care of their young and grow a human being here in our community, and call it a community instead of a city or whatever we call it that separates one person from another. I mean, it's ridiculous that we face these issues today.
About 30 seconds, Jonah.
And all that I'm asking is that we make options available and access to differentiation of when the economy was good, when we actually took care of people, when we actually had the money and the funds, like during the Clinton administration. We have money to give to people, jobs, minimum wages that were not so cheap, and availability to good housing, not just shelter. I end my statement. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, is there anyone else who would like to comment at this time?
Hi, good evening. My name is Natalie Beloy, and I live in the Ledyard Streets, and I'm sorry for coming in a few minutes late. Thank you for having this discussion. I just want to state really briefly that I support more options for safe camping, safe parking, tiny house villages in town, and I hope that you'll work closely with Homes Now and the most impacted communities that will be most impacted by these decisions that you're making tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Last chance. Anybody else want to speak? Okay, seeing no one, we will close opportunity for public comment. Thank you all for speaking. And again, just a reminder that there will be additional opportunities down the road in this process, both in front of this body and also in front of council, because this will go through their process as well. Anything to add to that? Yeah.
So I'll thank the members of the community who spoke this evening for the heartfelt comments. Just a couple of things. The process we're engaged in this room and this body is not proposing to establish any uses. It's defining a process. And I'd encourage you, for your feelings you've expressed, to come to our council meetings, because they're the policymakers who choose which programs to advance and not. Similarly, the Planning Commission tonight is narrowly focused. They're not establishing a policy base. They're looking to say, how do we review projects as they come forward? So you might see a little bit of a disconnect. Not endorsing or saying it's inappropriate. They're just saying this is what would happen if one came forward, not proposing it per se. I should also note that consistent with some of the comments that were received, we are looking to see if we could take the tiny homes into more of a longer term use. So there might be 2 variations of that, and hope to develop that for you at your next meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Okay, so I think that, Rick, Lisa, our goal is to have a discussion, right? And maybe we could start with bigger picture questions, if anybody has any, related to the, like Rick said, related to the ordinance. And then if we want to take the time to go through section by section, we could. I kind of would defer to but maybe we just start with general discussion. No, well, I mean, what's the best way to get into it? We always discuss this. Steve, you're shaking your head. What do you think?
Let's throw out the general stuff, and if we need to get specific, let's get specific.
Yeah, so if you have something that's specific to a section, I guess we can just go to that too, and we'll jump around a little bit. I mean, yeah, because I had a couple broad questions, but let's just open it up. I don't want to start. Does anybody have anything they want to ask about? Sorry, yeah.
I had one general question. I appreciated that the proposal acknowledged that that homelessness results in immediate threats to health and wellness, and I was wondering, I did some research and couldn't find any statistics on the number of deaths or visits to the hospital in Bellingham associated with homelessness, and I was wondering if you had any facts on that to help put context how urgent the threat is.
What I can say, it's fairly significant. That's why the city is working with partners in the county on the GRACE program. Absent permanent housing, you rely on the emergency room or call tone-outs for paramedic services to provide health care, and usually it's acute by the time it's warranted. So we're trying to find ways as a community to better address those services preventatively rather than as a cause, and that's the GRACE program. I can certainly send you a link to it, but there is a correlation between public health and facilities, and again, it's the disconnect to access the facilities and limited recourse of where you can go.
Steve?
In looking over all the temporary options and the permanent options, I don't have any specific objections to the direction that we're going and working on some kind of an approval. But I do have a problem with each category, and that is the code of conduct. It says that the sponsor or managing agency shall provide and enforce a written code of conduct. And it also should mitigate the impacts of the neighbors in the community. My question is, why are you leaving it to the agency or the sponsor to provide a code of conduct? Why doesn't the city provide this? And this is coupled with the permitting process. You either comply or you do not get the permit. I think if you're going to leave it up to every agency to come up with a code of conduct, you're going to have as many different codes as you do applicants. I think this is a very, very important area. When I see different panels talking about objections within neighborhoods, it's normally due to a code of conduct. So my question or my request would be, I think the city should provide a blanket code of conduct that can be more specific by the sponsor or the agency if need be. But there should be minimum codes that apply to each and every one of these sections and not left up to you tell us what the code is going to be.
I could respond on that. Certainly, we can have some basic premises that go. However, there's such broad populations that are served that the code of conduct is very different. Dealing with moms and kids will have a different code of conduct, for example, than dealing with adults in terms of noise, things like that. However, you're right. There may be some general principles that can go forward. We've used the Share a Wheel Code of Conduct. Share a Wheel is two homeless advocacy groups in Seattle that manage a number of facilities who've developed a fairly good code of conduct, and we could extract some things that might be common to all populations and include it.
I think that's a good idea, and I'd like to see something like that at our next work session. Thank you.
Anybody have comment on that particular question? Nope. Iris?
I'd be open to see some suggestions. I think we should avoid a paternalistic top-down approach, though, for, I think a lot of the agencies that would be open to sponsoring would probably be in a better position to work with the city to come up with a code that worked for the city and for that community.
Lisa?
Agree with both. I kind of see something in the middle of the road. It would be nice to see a minimum list, things that would be appropriate across the board, and then perhaps suggested based on some uniqueness of what type of housing. You might have something different for a car than you would for a tiny home, but I also think that the agency has to have a certain level of having, I don't want to say a buy-in, but sometimes based on the population, in order to have ownership of a community, the community would want to have a voice, kind of like how you would elect a board, but they might want to be able to augment that code of conduct to reflect their specific unity of what kind of community they're creating. And so I wouldn't want to create something so tight that there wouldn't be the opportunity for the residents to have a voice in weighing in on some of the conduct.
Well, I think it'd be interesting to get some ideas too, based on what Steve said. Just a baseline. There's surely some things that everyone should be adhering to, and then you make a really good point about those agencies knowing what's important, and I think that's what you were saying. So I think there's enough critical mass to ask the staff to present maybe a baseline. It also, I think that would set an expectation, like a baseline sets kind of an expectation for those agencies that might want to operate, like, hey, it's not a free-for-all. So, other comments on this? Garrett, and then Steve?
My question was on the RCW section that was applying to religious organizations. It sounds like there's basically an exemption for those organizations to operate outside of our code. How does that apply if they're using a conditional use permit to operate?
Interesting, you caught the conflict. I think it's the conditional use probably can't be denied, but we can condition it. And we might have to talk a little bit about that, because the issue would be is they're allowed to establish it. All we can do is condition it to do it. Now, our conditions are binding through either the process we do now or through a conditional use permit. We'll reconcile that. That's a very good point.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
I still don't necessarily understand that completely. Because I had a question kind of on that too. So are these rules that we're proposing, this process, intended to apply to facilities that are operated by religious organizations?
And others.
And others.
Yes.
So we're still uniformly applying these. We just couldn't say deny an application if a church made one.
No, and there's, when we did our comprehensive plan, we were unaware of the purview. Remember that several years ago in terms of the RCW to provide the preemption. And we have an inconsistency there because the conditional use is a process where typically you either approve with conditions or deny. Well, if it's a religious organization, we can't deny. So therefore now we're into the issue of how do we reconcile that? And you raise a good point. We'll have to work on that one.
And then just to follow on that, but if it was a nonprofit, because there's another example, if it was a nonprofit sponsor, that application could be denied. If it was a non-religious sponsor?
If it is non-religious, unless it's explicit in the ordinance that it's allowed, it could be denied. That's correct. Okay. So if a social service agency decided to run a shelter, the shelter was conditional use because it was in a commercial area. After the end of the hearing examiner said, no, this is not a good fit, it would be denied. Okay. But if it was a religious organization, we run into the preemption, and they might argue they shouldn't have to do a conditional use at all. We should just be able to condition it through the provisions of this ordinance. So it sounds like we'll be talking with our attorneys soon to resolve that one.
This is pretty new. Do you know of any litigation that's occurred related to this state law by other community, like religious organizations in other communities? Because I thought what I was thinking about is what if we write rules and some religious organization contests them as inconsistent with the RCW?
Actually, as I understand the genesis of this action by the legislature, it was a response to the suits associated with the tent cities. And what happened is the tent cities were established in areas, I think Woodinville took them to court saying you can't do it, and the religious folks were able to prevail, but there was a time limit. They had to be temporary. And the legislature was trying to find some way of encouraging the need and preempting those kind of challenges. Because they're, in the instance, again, I'm citing Woodinville, but I'm pretty sure it's that case. They could have said it was not allowed at all. And that's sort of the rub you get into. So yeah, I don't think it's been challenged whether they think we're too onerous, but I think the test on this would be, are we reasonably imposing conditions that preserve public health, safety, and welfare, rather than adjudicating whether it's a good location or a bad location?
Thank you.
I think this is a general question. The beginning of our packet talks about some of the current temporary encampment or current sites, and it talks about how people would have to be in pre-recovery from addiction. Would that be required for these temporary encampment sites, or would there be, I want to ensure that that's not part of what we're looking at here.
Well, again, there's multiple populations. You might, and we could certainly send you the link. The Seattle Times covered 3 days ago the Lighton Springs encampment. That's a tiny village encampment that is no barrier in terms of drug use, and talked about its effect on the neighborhood there. It's a good question. We are just getting our arms around the extent of it. I think what we're imagining here are, for virtually all of the uses we're considering, we can't imagine a code of conduct that would allow the use of illegal drugs, and quite frankly, in many cases, alcohol.
Anything else? I had a question about just clarifying again. It looks like we have some limitations. I just want to make sure I'm reading this correctly. 200 residents in temporary building encampments, and then separate from that, 300 in the other temporary facilities, and then no limit on permanent facilities. Is that the proposal?
Yeah, we were trying, the intent of staff was trying to find a balance to meet what we believe and need. Now, it's been asserted tonight that our point-in-time counts are incorrect, but we use those because that's the only data we've got that we can at this point. We'll look into the other sources identified, but we're trying to find enough to accommodate that the entire population. And we're waiting for the 2018 point-in-count to be released, so we can see if we have to adjust it. That's where those numbers came from. We're trying to say, can we find enough combination of things to meet a population estimate?
And how many permanent beds do we have now?
In facilities?
Yeah, it's just the mission, right?
No, we have a number of supportive housing units. We have probably about 500 beds.
Okay.
Probably more, if we counted them all up that deal with folks who are unsheltered in various transitional areas. So it's one where we're trying to avoid the size issue of being too big. Be sort of, here's the cap. Anything more than that, we think we would experience significant issues. We're also trying to accommodate enough choices that we could find some blend. And again, we're not proposing any of these uses. We're hoping others would, bring those forward. And in the end, we could try different approaches to see what will work best for the populations.
Thank you. Mike, and then...
I wanted to ask about the duration, the 90 days for temporary. Is the idea there, so say a group of 4 hypothetical churches got together to do safe parking, as an example. They're allowed to do that for 90 days. It could be renewed once. Would the idea there to be sort of they would rotate around and come back, and it wouldn't just be sited at one location year-round? And is that consistent with, not deny the preemption of religious organizations that you can say yes, but also only 90 days at a time?
Yeah, I think the thing is there are, unfortunately, there are impacts in the communities where these are cited. We don't know all the circumstances. We did map all the religious facilities that would qualify, and there are a number of them in neighborhoods and zoning districts throughout the city. Each one's going to be unique. Some might have very limited impacts on the neighborhood in terms of noise or travel or trips or things like that, and some might have profound because of the location of the facilities and proximity of others. The intent here is a temporary facility is supposed to be temporary. It's something to stopgap, it's to meet a need. We want to allow enough time to make it viable, but the hope would be it would move to a different location. Those tiny homes, we will consider, of course, a longer-term version, as Seattle did, but most of those were designed on skids to be moved fairly quickly. The intent here might be that we could do a longer-term, couple of year kind of thing in the right circumstances, but for that duration, we have to make sure that impacts are reduced significantly.
Thanks.
Along the same lines, some of the impacts that the folks from Homes Now shared with us for moving, particularly the tiny homes, would be a cost of around $1,100 each time to move it, even on the skids, just to sort of pack it up, as well as in looking at people, for one, I mean, people's homes. I can't imagine moving every 90 days, especially if I was working on finding work and services. I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit more about the benefits or reasons for 90 days.
Many of the tiny homes that are provided, and we could talk to, Homes Now's track record is 2 units. The Low Income Institute has well over 150 established at this point in multiple locations. They've got a pretty good handle on it. It is costly to move them, but they do have a model that works, and some are built on chassis so they can be towed to allow greater flexibility. I think one of the challenges on this is that these are not, again, these are not the tiny homes that you see on television. These are very simple shelters. There is a significant safety hazard in these facilities, just so you know. If the tent catches fire, it flames up and it's gone. If one of these facilities catches fire, people die. That's the risk, so it's fairly significant. We see them as a potential short-term gap, need. But for long-term use, it's not the right design. Now, if you want to go to Quixote Village in Olympia, those are more like the ones you see on TV that have plumbing and have electrics and insulation and their bigger footprint, and those are permanently established. And that's a different animal. That would be something that would be permanently established in a location that could exist for many years into the future. And we're very supportive of that too, but that's not the subject of this ordinance. We're looking at the very short-term fix. In the case of Homes Now, they might be able to, should we come back to you with some amendments in terms of a long-term plan, but it's a couple of years. It's not forever. The forever would need that next zen, that next thing, plumbing, heat, electricity, probably a little bigger, more like Quixote Village in Olympia.
I would like to hear next time a little more feedback on 90 days in terms of maybe feedback from the public or from you all or from some of our agencies like Opportunity Council. Not having experienced homelessness, I might imagine that it would take more than 90 days to get back on your feet in terms of getting yourself set up with another more permanent type of housing, whether that be through Opportunity Council or another agency. And I imagine that it would potentially be destabilizing to need to move within 90 days.
Lisa?
So on page 9, number D, I just would like a little bit more insight on where it states that the primary purpose of which is to provide temporary shelter during extreme weather conditions or other instances where additional shelter is needed for the homeless. Could you talk a little bit about what other instances would perhaps refer to and why it's included, or even just bad weather? I mean, if we're addressing short-term housing, I'm assuming it's year-round, not just during bad weather. So other instances is pretty broad, and I'd like to just have a better idea why that's included.
Again, it's a range of services and providers. This could be a church opening up its basement in wintertime for cold weather shelter. It could be a not-for-profit that's providing longer-term housing until folks can get into permanent housing. Our definitions have evolved. We'll take a closer look at expanding the broader use. Perhaps we could take another pass at that. When we started this, we were looking for the emergency, the need to get something on the ground soon. And I think the sense is that as we look closer at it, some of these will be of longer duration. So maybe we have to explain that and what we're looking for there.
Yeah, I was just thinking if you deleted provide temporary shelter and then where additional shelter is needed, just because when you're giving a specific example and then a very broad general example, it seems to, for me, leave the question what the other instances are, because the instant is the lack of housing and the fact that people are in need of shelter.
Thank you. Mike?
In a similar realm, near there, both in the slides and on section D that Lisa just mentioned, it talks about governmental entities, but the sponsor section only lists nonprofits and religious organizations. Is there an intent that a city, county, port, or like higher ed institution or something like that could be the sponsoring entity that owns the land? And would that sponsor section need to be, opened up to increase that possibility?
Yes, that's a good point. Universities have done it. University of Washington did host an encampment. So there's a provision that can be done. We could broaden that. However, we are cautious about opening it to private sector uses because the risk for abuse of these facilities for populations not intended for financial gain could be significant.
And you're just suggesting the government entity to make it more consistent?
We would absolutely support that.
That's a good catch.
And port or city or other agency can certainly do it. But just so you know why we made the demarcation.
Right. Okay.
Rick, you mentioned in one of the slides, I think one of you talked about there was two laws. One was the religious organization exemption, the other one was a building code exemption. Is that what's allowing something like this tiny house development to go forward without potable water and without, appropriate, electrical facilities and things that would normally be required by the building code?
So the exemption deals with buildings, and it deals with existing buildings, not tiny homes which are purpose-built.
So only,
The workaround that Seattle used, which we're modeling our approach on, was these are buildings that are small enough to be exempt from building permit. And the building official, to be fair, under a great deal of political pressure, because had significant concern about flammability and life safety, consider them to be tents with walls. So that's how they get established. We spoke with our building official. He has some discomfort in this. He is on the State Building Code Council. He's very current on what the rules are, and that's where the additions for fire and smoke detectors, banning open flames, things like that came from. The risk for past fires in these facilities, if folks get cold at night, they bring a heater in, the heater falls over, and there's combustion. So it isn't an ideal approach. Now, if we move back to the idea of what some are broader ones that have plumbing or other uses, there were provisions in the legislature that were proposed this year, and the governor line-itemed them out that would have exempted buildings under 300 feet from building code. So you could do more things. It would have reduced the square footage minimum size for living space to try to get tiny homes there. The governor didn't do it because he was mean-spirited. He referred it to the Building Code Council and said, give us some better rules for life safety, and then we'll be able to affect that. So I do think those kind of uses, those ones that are more like Quixote Village, those might be the longer-term ones, and we might be able to put a placeholder in there to accommodate those. And I do think they would be for a longer duration, and we can talk about how long that might be.
Thank you. Iris?
On page 9 and the definitions of section 2, managing agency is the organization identified as the manager of the temporary facility. And I was wondering who identifies the criteria for that managing agency? How and who can be a managing agency?
It's the same entity as the sponsor. So the sponsor, we're just looking for accountability in terms of the way this is established. I think that's the right. Yeah, maybe the same. It should, well, I think the sense is we were trying to say here's the rub. We actually had a member of the clergy who came in and said, I'm happy to sign a lease for anyone who needs a space to do temporary housing. And by signing a lease, it's under the provision of land owned or leased by a church. However, we need to get some authority, because the church clearly is more like a third party there. They're just signing it to get the preemption. So we need to find somebody who's going to be the body on the site that is responsible to enforce the code of conduct, to do the application, things like that. So we had to separate the two out. I think that it doesn't have to. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at the definition and the way that you read it, I mean, it could be a different entity. But we could certainly clarify that it would need to be a religious organization, nonprofit, or, you know, those others that we have listed.
Government agency.
Government agency, one of those.
That kind of goes with another question I had, because I assume that on that section G of section 4, where it says supervision, on-site supervision must be provided at all times, I assume that that was keying back to the sponsor or managing agency. And we found some examples of places that were run not necessarily by a managing agency, but were self-governed or self-run by volunteers who are also residents. And I was wondering if that would be possible.
That's the, again, the Low Income Housing Institute uses residents to provide it. However, we need to have a fairly certain, we have to have assurance that the provisions of the ordinance will be met. Someone needs to be there and accountable 24 hours a day. Okay, that's when you're putting folks into what we acknowledge are facilities that are not permanent. There are a number of issues that come up. You need to have someone present. So while they could be employees or residents or others, we need to have the assurance that they're going to meet these requirements.
A group of residents could organize, and if they showed the city that they had the capacity to manage it, they could, but they would have to show evidence of that, is what you're saying.
Yeah, track record is a good thing. We really we'd be looking to say, do we have a reasonable assurance that these rules will be followed and the standards will be met? And absent that, you'd have to pull the permit. And these standards are not punitive. I think you think, perhaps you disagree, but I think that everything we've described, the risk to the public safety is pretty great, just because of the nature of the facilities. We may be in a building that may not have sprinklers or lighted fire exits, or, you know, if someone's not there, you know, doing the fire watch, you shouldn't be using that building.
Yeah.
That's the kind of obligation we're after.
Mike?
I had the same thought about supervision. I felt that it just needed more of a definition. You know, if the supervision plan would be part of the permit or part of the application, so that you know, site-specific, population-specific, you could decide, yes, that is a supervision plan that would work. It's self-managed, or no, you need a paid staff 24 hours a day. Different situations may warrant something, but expanding on that to make it clear how they can meet that requirement of fulfilling the supervision, because I think we're all sharing that supervision is key.
I think that's important, and I wonder, I was just thinking as you were talking, in section 8 where it talks about application requirements, one of them is a written summary of the proposal responding to the standards and requirements of this ordinance. In other words, like maybe people need, to provide that supervision plan in, maybe it becomes a specific enumerated item, or maybe it's captured already in that, but I agree, it's important. Lisa?
Kind of getting back to the numbers again on page 14, I just want to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly. Kind of paraphrasing that a maximum of 300 people could be housed in the temporary safe parking encampment and the tiny house, and that no one location would not exceed 100. So I'm to assume that we could have 650s or 3 100s, and then we'd top out. If the numbers dramatically change, that, you know, we have more than what's stipulated in here, say the 3,000 that was mentioned, that's countywide, not necessarily city, or in an event of a natural disaster like the big earthquake, and we find a lot of people become temporary and sheltered, how quickly could something change the cap of that number so that that could be elevated? Or would it have to come back here, or would it make sense to put a provision clause that would have the ability to elevate that number if it warranted it?
So you raise a good point, because it is related to the issue of emergency. If we have a natural disaster and we declare an emergency, all of these rules can be suspended immediately. And essentially, there is a provision that allows for new rulemaking to be made on the spot without public process because of the urgency of the circumstance. There's a public safety committee that meets with the mayor, at least in these emergencies, who meets virtually daily to deal with changes and adaptation because its risk to human life is so great. We're guided by FEMA in that, in our hazard management plan. So there is a full process, and these uses wouldn't be used in a sense. So if we did have an emergency, we'd be in a different ballgame.
So good to know that part's set aside. But if this goes through and there's a lot of interest and the 300 cap gets met pretty quickly, and we find that we still have quite a need, would that be able to be extended, or would it have to come back through this process?
It would have to be amended. I would say practically, we've been working for 3 years to try to find partners to do any of these, and have not been successful.
Iris?
Other than the short-term low barrier shelter and Lighthouse Mission, I don't mean to slight them. They've been extraordinary, but in terms of the temporary measures, other than that, we've had some issues. Some have proposed them. Homes Now has been a frequent critic of the city. They are allowed to find land and establish their use. We'd review them through this process.
Did you have a comment?
Yes, I had a question on section 3A on page 10 that lines the setbacks for temporary encampments to be 20 feet from the industrial, commercial, multifamily, and 40 feet from single family. Can you share why those setbacks were in place, or what the reasoning is for those specific setbacks?
Those are ones we found in other ordinances based on experience that were established. They're trying to provide a separation between dissimilar uses. There's the ability in this ordinance for the director to reduce any of those for unique site circumstances if there's adequate separation. It provides one of the issues we understand from those running the encampments in Seattle is not so much to keep people in, but to avoid folks having access into the site other than through controlled measures. You need to have separation to do that. It's more of having a single point of entry is very important. I would note that Francis Place uses that model, for example, and that's been very helpful in efficacy, so that everyone who's coming and going is coming through one way. So all of these separation things and is to try to design a way to have this be more standalone and separate from other uses, so that access can be controlled and separation of noise and other dissimilar uses.
Anybody else have comments? Questions? Lisa, yeah?
Probably getting a little more into the specifics. When we talk about some of the health and safety, there is the part where, battery operated smoke alarm. I didn't find anywhere here where there would be a requirement for a fire extinguisher available on site. And then also, I would recommend a notice of emergency contact numbers posted as a requirement. But I'm kind of concerned about the fire extinguisher because I do believe in the cold, people will have open flame or something, and they should be posted and a map of where people can find them.
Thank you. Iris?
I'm looking now at section 3.0 on page 12. And in reading it end in, I think a lot of the conversations that we have about this issue, our assumptions can be that this space will be dangerous, or that there'll be activities that are bad. And I think this section, to me, has a tone of that, and I think I hope that we can look at it and potentially revise it to promote safety while not potentially insinuating that, without having that tone that's makes some assumptions about about danger. And part of the questions that I had about this section were if the verifiable identification information would include requiring people to have a driver's license, and if the log of names and dates that people stayed, which needed to be made available to municipal and county law enforcement, if we could ensure that that also included that it would not be able to be made available to federal immigration enforcement.
Well, that's a standard city policy, so there's no need, and we could repeat it if you wish, but I think that's already established policy. I know this sounds pejorative, it's by its nature, and certainly if we were looking at a shelter for families or some other issues, it may not be as much of an issue. However, this is sort of the standard that's been established, and it's not meant to judge folks who are there, but it's the minimum standard we have to have for the shelter. Now, we could say, I asked the Lighthouse Mission, I was with Chief Dahl, and we asked what they're doing now, and they do help folks who don't have IDs to get IDs. And it's not, you have to have a driver's license. They're actively working. They will still take people in. There is concern about folks who have active warrants. And that's an issue that has to be addressed. Now, it may not be applicable if we're dealing with a certain kind of shelter, but it does come in others. We could say, so I don't know exactly how to handle this. I'm trying to meet what we find to be the standard we need for protection for in general, acknowledging that some cases wouldn't warrant, there's really not a risk here.
I think that there's lots of people who are put into a position in life where they have to go into a shelter or a temporary facility who otherwise would be, in a home, and we've heard from some of those people. And I think a lot of this is about protecting those other individuals within the communities, not necessarily stigmatizing the community encampment as a whole, but making sure that the people who are there, who maybe don't want to be there, a lot of them probably don't, who are regular people, are protected from risk. And so I get, tone and creating, a perception about these groups, but I also think it's really important to make sure we're protecting those people who are in there. And we need some of these tests to do that. We need to know, for the benefit of those people there, whether, who they're sleeping next door to on a cot, in a room with 100 other people. So, I mean, I would be open to language, Iris, to maybe to try and massage that language if you feel it's necessary, but I'm opposed to any removal of any, running warrants, addressing sex offender issues, things like that. We need to make sure those people aren't in those facilities. That's where I'm at on it.
I agree. I think the content is appropriate, just for the same reason. When I read that, I felt that if I had a family member who was, or myself in a situation, I would want to know that the person above me, next to me, that I had some sense of feeling a little safer. And then also for the people who are volunteering, if there's someone who has a warrant for their arrest, and depending on what the situation was, we have to make sure that the volunteers are also feeling that they're aware of who they're assisting. So I can understand the tone, but I think the content is very important to be in there.
I would be open to, as we move forward, suggestions for how to address that. But
I would argue, and this isn't transparent, that this isn't my argument, but something that was shared with me that helped me understand this a little better. But I think requiring folks to, sorry, I'm just catching where we are, requiring folks to contact the police if someone came through with an active warrant. I certainly agree with the safety of folks living within the residence, but an active warrant for sleeping on the sidewalk or failure to appear is certainly different than an active warrant for robbery or for a violent crime. And so I think the intent of the end of Section P, in the opinion of the off-duty point of contact, or on-duty point of contact, is that the person might be a threat to the community. That intent makes a lot of sense, but putting this organization or the sponsor organization in a place of contacting the police if someone comes with an active warrant creates a very different environment. And having worked for several nonprofits, I've served many clients who I wouldn't know if they had an active warrant or not, but I certainly would know or be able to make decisions based on ensuring the safety of the people within the organization and who are within that community. I think that was a better barometer than necessarily someone's criminal history.
That's a good point. And maybe this is something we need to carry on in the discussion as we move forward and think about ways to address that within the language of those two sections. And I don't expect us to come up with that tonight, but you make a very good point. Anybody else comment tonight? I'd like to say that I really am glad that you are processing these without charge. I was looking for the fee and I couldn't find it, and then I found that section, and I thought that's really important. And I'd just like to echo, I think what Steve said is, I'm generally, personally, having reviewed this, it seems like we're moving in the right direction. And that seems like it's evident from the lack of, broader discussion. We're down into the weeds, and so, I'm excited to see it come back, and I think we have to move forward. So does anybody else have any other comment on this draft?
I have one question.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear more on section 3H is regarding not having minors. And I'd be really curious to hear what some of our youth serving agencies like Northwest Youth Services and what their feedback is and on where the rationale for that is. And I assume it's a safety issue, and at the same time with such a significant amount of homeless youth in our community and how unsafe it is for them to be couch surfing or put in a place of potentially being assaulted. I would want to ensure that we're providing as many services as possible for homeless youth.
And that's 22 North. That's being constructed right now. That's to meet that niche, because it is very difficult to serve in like in the drop-in center or it's difficult to serve in other areas. It's a unique niche. There's very vulnerable populations. So Northwest User Services has been fairly proactive in seeking facilities for that population, and we'd want to encourage it. It's a different animal. That's a permanent residential facility that they're establishing now. Just so you know, it's the range of behaviors from very well managed to challenging. In the very well managed ones, the share a wheel ones in Seattle, if I showed you the code of conduct, you might be somewhat surprised. There are men's tents and women's tents, and men may not go into women's tents, and women may not go into men's tents. And there's no alcohol, there's no drugs allowed at all. It's very prescribed, and that's why they're very safe for all the residents that are there and continue. At our drop-in center with the Lighthouse Mission that's providing right now, it's staffed. There are people there 24/7 who are trained at de-escalation and work with this population every day. But we still have 2 calls for service at least from police every day in that location. So, there's a range where we have to protect, it's from there's such an extreme range here. Sometimes it comes across that we're going to the bottom end. But to be very honest, often the rules we write are for those worst case scenarios.
Thank you. So if no further discussion, then I think you've heard some feedback from all the commissioners and some suggestions to come back with. And so is the idea that then you would return with maybe feedback on those items, any revisions at the next work session?
I think so. We've got we're going to see what we can do in 2 weeks. First of all, this was really great. Thank you for your very thoughtful and focused comments. That's very, very helpful for us. We have no preordained outcome on this ordinance. We just want to do the best we can that's implementable. So we'll take a look at it. If we can get it turned around in time, we'll come back. I do think a couple of key overarching threads is to look at more of the longer term, and that was good point you raised for some of the like tiny home uses and others, and see how that might be done. And then to reconcile, it may not be timely for us to come back till we figure out this conditional use. That's a legacy from our comp plan, may not be applicable now only in non-religious organization applications. But at the same token, council amended the interim to allow not-for-profits to do what religious groups would do. So we'll have to reconcile that. So we'll see when we see, I guess is the best way to put it. We'll be working hard on this one.
Okay. Well, thank you. And thank you for answering questions and presentation. And we don't really have, so with that, we'll close the work session. And thank you, everybody, for contributing. Is there anything, Rick, that you'd like to talk about aside from tonight's topic? Any updates or anything? Our next meeting is May 3rd, which is next Thursday, and that's going to be a work session on the subdivision ordinance. So coming back around on that,
Yeah, we've the last chapter, I think, was crafted. So we've got all the pieces now. It's very exciting. Thank you for your patience, but we're able to bring additional resources to make that move faster, and we're glad it's time to bring that forward. We do appreciate you devoting every week. I know that is a very, you guys have lives beyond this room, and we really thank you for taking the time to do it. We're in a time where there are a number of issues coming forward, and we need to advance them, and we appreciate you being flexible enough to meet to address it. We will be coming on the 17th for the annual docket, and that's the 4 applications that have been received to date, and we'll talk about what those are. And then we have transportation regulations coming on the 31st. So we may or may not have the 10th because we may or may not be ready. And we'll come back when we have all of your questions answered to just make it as efficient as tonight was.
Yeah, I think with the discussion we had tonight, and it appeared as if there was no major hangups. I think if you can get those kind of questions addressed, we could move through that and move toward a hearing, which would be nice. Because I know there is some pressure on getting this resolved, right, permanently.
Yeah, we'd like to get permanent rules out there, just because I think they're, especially as we deal with longer-term facilities, let's go get those out there. If somebody really wants to provide them, let's see if we can find a way so they can.
Any commissioners have questions? Lisa?
I'd just like to have a little bit a better idea as far as how we're addressing subdivision. The next meeting, are we just focusing on the new chapter? Because this subdivision, I think, has been hop skipping for a couple of years, and I don't think every commissioner was at the beginning of it. So, you know, how is this going to be presented and then going forward? Because there's things to be caught up, things to, you know, just so I know what the next session is really going to be focusing on.
I think it's
Big
fair.
packet.
I think it's fair that, you know, we'll have gotten all the pieces together. There's probably a chance to get some focused discussion on all of it together and look for internal consistency and answer your questions when you do it. I'll talk with Kathy and talk about how she wishes to approach working with you on it. We appreciate it. It's been a long process, but I think all the pieces are there, and now we could put it together and say, what have we got? Does this work?
I echo that, though, because this is focused on this one chapter, and we went through the other chapters or other sections individually. I'm okay focusing on this at the next meeting, but like you just said, at some point, all those pieces got to come together, and I think it would be beneficial to this body to have a work session on that put together thing before we go to a hearing. Because for me, you know, a year ago was the last time we talked about those other chapters. I don't really fully remember, you know, and I'm going to go back and read my packets, but it would just be good for us all, whether it happens before this or after this. I'm okay either way.
We'll talk to Kathy.
I just want to be prepared because I'm focusing on the new chapter.
Yeah.
And if we come next week and then people are pulling stuff from all the other chapters and start talking about it,
I don't think so.
then, you know, I'm going to just quit my job and focus on the whole thing for the entire week. And I just kind of want to have a heads up how best to approach it so that I'm prepared.
I think as a body, we should limit our discussion at the next meeting to what has been presented to us. But I'm asking that we have an opportunity to look at the collective whole.
What I'm hearing you say is what we could do is bring the new chapter, then have a separate session where we send you everything, soup to nuts. It's the entire work. And then it will be basically going through everything, sort of an overview and asking for inconsistencies, clarifications, gaps. Are we missing things that we need to do? Things like that. That would be useful, I would guess.
I think it would be useful. It may not end up being very long. We did go through this in detail, and I wouldn't see that as an opportunity to start over completely with those other chapters, but to give everybody a chance to get their head around the whole. So, and yeah, maybe we get through this one and then we discuss how best to handle that. So thank you for bringing that up. Anybody else? Okay, thank you very much. We'll adjourn.
Go into retirement for the next